there are alliances. And then there is the relationship between the United States and Israel. Over the decades, Washington has given Israel more American aid than any other foreign country, defended it repeatedly at the United Nations, and treated its security as a matter of American strategy. To supporters, that bond is essential. To critics, it is one of the most expensive and least conditional partnerships in modern foreign policy. But that relationship did not appear overnight. It was built step by step through war ideology, oil, Cold War rivalry, and political choices made over generations. The story begins in 1948, at the end of the British Mandate in Palestine. On May 14th, David Ben-Gurion declared the creation of the State of Israel. Within minutes, the United States recognized the new state. That decision was not automatic. Inside President Harry Truman's administration, there was fierce opposition. Secretary of State George Marshall warned that early recognition could damage American interests across the Arab world, especially at a moment when access to Middle Eastern oil and influence in the region were becoming strategically vital. Truman moved ahead anyway. His reasoning came from several directions at once. He had a personal sympathy for the Jewish claim to a homeland, shaped in part by his religious upbringing and in part by the human catastrophe of the Holocaust. He had also been pressed by people close to him, including his longtime friend Eddie Jacobson. And there was politics. It was an election year, and advisors understood that support for recognition could matter domestically. Moral conviction, electoral calculation, and personal belief all came together in one of the most consequential foreign policy decisions of the century. But for Palestinians, 1948 meant something entirely different. The land on which Israel was created was already inhabited by an Arab population that had lived there for generations. They had not agreed to the partition of the territory, and many rejected the legitimacy of the new state. War followed almost immediately. Arab armies entered the conflict, and the fighting transformed the map. By the time the war ended, Israel controlled more land than it had been allocated under the UN partition plan. The human consequences were immense. Roughly 700,000 Palestinians became refugees during the war through a combination of flight, fear, expulsions, and the collapse of Arab communities under military pressure. Hundreds of villages were emptied or destroyed. Palestinians remember this as the Nakba, the catastrophe. For them, the birth of Israel was inseparable from the loss of home, land, and political future. That unresolved wound would shape every stage of the conflict that followed. Even after recognition, the U.S.-Israel relationship was not yet the unshakable alliance it would later become. In the 1950s, Washington still viewed the Middle East primarily through a wider geopolitical lens. Oil mattered, Arab governments mattered, and above all, the Cold War mattered. The United States wanted influence across the region and did not want to drive Arab states into the Soviet camp. That became clear in 1956 during the Suez Crisis. After Egyptian President Gamal Abdel Nasser nationalized the Suez Canal, Britain and France secretly coordinated with Israel on a military operation. Israel invaded Sinai, and Britain and France moved in under the pretext of restoring order. President Dwight Eisenhower was furious when he learned what had happened. Far from backing Israel automatically, he pressured Israel, Britain, and France to withdraw. Washington even supported international condemnation until the operation ended. At that point, Israel was not yet being treated as an untouchable strategic partner. Still, the region was changing quickly. Egypt under Nasser became a center of Arab nationalism and increasingly accepted Soviet arms and support. Syria and Iraq also became arenas of superpower competition. American policymakers were trying to hold together two goals that were often in tension: sympathy for Israel and workable ties with Arab states. For a time, they tried to balance both. That balance broke in 1967. In the weeks before the Six-Day War, the region moved toward crisis. Egypt sent troops into Sinai, demanded the withdrawal of UN peacekeepers, and closed the Straits of Tiran to Israeli shipping. Arab rhetoric grew more threatening, and Israel believed it was being surrounded by hostile states. The Johnson administration urged restraint and tried to avoid war, But diplomacy went nowhere. On June 5th, Israel struck first, launching a surprise attack that destroyed much of Egypt's air force on the ground. In less than a week, Israel defeated the armies of Egypt, Jordan, and Syria and captured the Sinai Peninsula, Gaza, the West Bank, East Jerusalem, and the Golan Heights. Militarily, it was one of the most stunning victories of the modern era. Why that war happened, and whether it was an unavoidable act of self-defense, is still debated. Many Israelis and Western observers have described it as a necessary preemptive strike against a credible threat of destruction. Others, including some Israeli officials and historians, later argued that the danger was serious, but that a full-scale Arab invasion was not inevitable, and that Israeli leaders saw an opportunity as well as a threat. What is beyond dispute is what the war changed. Israel emerged not only alive, but vastly stronger, in control of territories that would become the core of the modern conflict. For Washington, the lesson was immediate. Israel had just defeated Soviet-backed Arab armies with extraordinary speed and without requiring American troops. In Cold War terms, that made Israel look less like a diplomatic complication and more like a regional asset. After 1967, U.S. thinking began to shift decisively. Israel was no longer simply a country Americans admired or felt morally bound to protect. It was increasingly seen as a reliable partner in a volatile, strategically critical region. That new logic was tested in 1973 during the Yom Kippur War. Egypt and Syria launched a surprise attack on Israeli positions in Sinai and the Golan Heights. In the opening phase of the war, Israeli losses were severe, and for a brief moment, the possibility of a major Israeli defeat seemed real. The Nixon administration responded with a massive emergency airlift, sending weapons, ammunition, and equipment to keep Israel in the fight. The resupply effort helped reverse the battlefield momentum, but it also raised the stakes globally. The Soviet Union backed Egypt and Syria, and the war brought both superpowers into a dangerous confrontation. At one point, the United States raised its military alert level amid fears of direct Soviet involvement. For American policymakers, the meaning of the crisis was unmistakable. Israel's survival had become tied to American credibility. The cost was not only strategic. Arab oil-producing states retaliated with an oil embargo, and the shock hit the United States hard. Fuel prices surged, shortages spread, and the American economy felt the consequences. Supporting Israel was no longer just a moral or diplomatic choice. It had become something that could affect daily life in the United States. After the war, Henry Kissinger tried to stabilize the region through step-by-step diplomacy. His goal was not simply peace for its own sake. It was to prevent another cycle of war, superpower confrontation, and oil disruption. That effort eventually led to one of the most important breakthroughs in Middle Eastern history. In 1977, Egyptian President Anwar Sadat traveled to Jerusalem and addressed the Israeli parliament. It was a stunning act. Egypt had fought Israel repeatedly and had been the central military power in the Arab camp. Now its leader was publicly speaking of peace. President Jimmy Carter seized the moment and brought Sadat and Israeli Prime Minister Menachem begin to Camp David in 1978. After nearly 2 weeks of tense negotiations, the result was a framework that led to the 1979 Egypt-Israel Peace Treaty. From the American point of view, this was a major strategic success. Egypt, once aligned with Moscow and locked in permanent conflict with Israel, moved firmly into the American orbit. Israel gained peace with the strongest Arab military power. The United States emerged as the key broker in the region. But there was another side to Camp David that is often overshadowed. The agreements also included a framework for Palestinian self-government in the occupied territories. That part never developed into meaningful Palestinian sovereignty. Years later, Carter himself would argue that the promise had been left unfulfilled, while Israeli control over the occupied territories deepened instead. Once again, Palestinians were central to the conflict, but marginal to the deal-making that defined it. When Ronald Reagan entered office, he viewed the Middle East through a harder Cold War framework. To Reagan, Israel was a strategic partner against Soviet influence and regional instability. In the early 1980s, military cooperation expanded, intelligence ties deepened, and formal agreements began to give the relationship more permanent structure. Israel was no longer just a close ally in practice. It was becoming embedded in the architecture of American regional policy. Then came Lebanon in 1982. Israel invaded, saying it aimed to push back the Palestine Liberation Organization after attacks from southern Lebanon. But the operation expanded far beyond a limited border campaign. Israeli forces moved all the way to Beirut, and the siege of the city caused heavy civilian suffering. Even Reagan, who was deeply supportive of Israel, reacted with anger to the scale of the destruction and temporarily suspended some weapons transfers. The most devastating moment came in September, after the assassination of Lebanese President-elect Bashir Gemayel. Israeli forces controlled the area around the Palestinian refugee camps of Sabra and Shatila and allowed allied Lebanese Christian militiamen to enter. Over the next several days, hundreds, and possibly far more, of civilians were killed. The massacre shocked the world and also shook Israel itself. A later Israeli Commission of Inquiry concluded that Israel bore indirect responsibility and found Defense Minister Ariel Sharon personally responsible for failing to prevent the killings. He was forced to resign as defense minister. The United States was drawn further into Lebanon, sending Marines as part of an international force. In 1983, a bombing killed 241 American service members in Beirut. It was one of the deadliest attacks on U.S. forces in decades. Washington eventually withdrew. And yet, rather than loosening the bond with Israel, the Reagan years strengthened it. Intelligence cooperation grew. Military aid increased. Agreements allowed American equipment to be stored on Israeli soil for use in emergencies. By the end of the decade, the alliance had become institutional, not just political. While all of this was happening, Palestinians in the West Bank and Gaza were living under an occupation that had begun in 1967 and showed no sign of ending. In 1987, the First Intifada erupted, a mass uprising driven largely by a younger generation that had spent its entire life under Israeli rule. The images of teenagers confronting soldiers with stones put the occupation into full view for global audiences. But even then, American policy remained overwhelmingly anchored to its partnership with Israel rather than to any urgent effort to resolve Palestinian statelessness. By the end of the Cold War, the relationship had been transformed. What began in 1948 as a rapid act of recognition shaped by Holocaust memory, domestic politics, and Truman's personal convictions had become a strategic alliance reinforced by war, superpower rivalry, regional diplomacy, and formal military cooperation. The wars of 1967 and 1973 convinced Washington that Israel was a powerful regional asset. The peace process with Egypt showed that the alliance could also serve broader American goals. Reagan's policies gave that partnership durable institutional form. And through all of it, one reality remained unresolved. The United States had found reasons again and again to deepen its support for Israel. But the Palestinians displaced in 1948, occupied after 1967, and promised autonomy, without receiving it, were never fully brought into the center of American policy. By 1990, support for Israel was no longer just a presidential choice made in moments of crisis. It had become part of the structure of American power in the Middle East.